academic context, because what happens in the policy space, what happens in the public sector, what happens at the executive level operates within a body of ideas that emerge out of academia, out of scholarship. So I will start out by first giving some amount of academic context, and then we will transition into highlighting some of the key issues that continues to undermine successful policy implementation in Jamaica. But we also want to look at what are some of the things that we have done to improve our stocks as it relates to policy implementation. So if we were to get into a discussion about policy implementation, we must first understand what is a policy essentially, and how does government, when you hear them speak about policies, what policies essentially means. So policy in a nutshell is actions or inaction by the government as it regards to addressing issues as they emerge within the society. Key within this definition is I want to highlight is action and inaction. So as a society, we continuously are faced with problems. Policies essentially are the solutions that governments devise to address the problems that we face. The solutions usually are reflected in a course of action that is taken. However, alternatively, it can also be in inaction. So it is a policy of the government if the government chooses not to adopt a particular approach to addressing an issue. As it relates to policies, there are various categories of policies. So if you want to look at health policies, social policies, education policies, there are a slew of various categorizations under which policies really can fall. So policy implementation. So we have been discussing that policies really are approaches, actions that governments devise to respond to issues and problems that emerge within the society. Once you have devised those policies, it is now at the stage you have to decide how you will action those policies. So it is all good to have a document that outlines clearly how we're going to address an issue. However, it really comes down to how we are going to do it. And this is manifested in what is called policy implementation. So policy implementation really is a process of interaction between the goals that you have set and the actual actions that you will have to take to meet those goals. So within policy documents, usually goals are set. So a policy document on poverty, for example, a policy response to addressing poverty, it will have broad objectives, it will have goals. Those goals, however, will have to be aligned with a process that will be used to ensure the realization of those goals. And so these processes usually can be found within the policy implementation process. And again, the policy implementation process really entail an element of the policy cycle, because the implementation of policies really it takes place in a cycle. And so there are various stages to the development of policies, and implementation is really one of those elements. And so essentially implementation tries to realize the objectives of the policy as it is outlined within a policy document. So generally speaking, involved in the development of policies, there are usually three key activities that are involved in implementation of policies. So first, the policy must speak to organization, it must speak to interpretation, and it must speak to application. So organization essentially looks at how the issue that has been identified, how it will be addressed. It will also look at the mechanisms, the systems, the processes, the entities that will be required to effect the implementation process. The interpretation aspect of the implementation process deals strictly with how do you define the problem that the policy is attempting to solve. So when we identify an issue, when we devise a policy, the policy must articulate clearly how the problem is defined. And it is based on the definition of the problem that we are able to come up with solutions. And then application is pretty much the end result of all of that development process that would have gone into policy development. So application now will look at how we go about implementing these policies, because it is at this stage of application that most of the issues that hinder policy development arise. Not sure why my slide's not moving. Let me stop sharing and then reshare to see if it will address that. Perfect. So the importance of implementation in the policy process. So as I would have mentioned earlier, implementation of policies really operate within an academic context. There are some academic assumptions about implementation. And so we can see that oftentimes what you find is that whenever you formulate a policy, the inherent assumption is that once the policy is formulated and it is enacted and adopted, it will logically be implemented. However, this is not necessarily the case, because there are several things that are operating, whether it be at an institutional level or at the policy level itself, that might affect the overall implementation. So not because the executive might come up with a policy that necessarily means that it will be successfully implemented, because when rubber hits road, that is where the major issues will come up. So we are now into the realm of looking at some of the reasons for unsuccessful implementation. And these reasons are, generally speaking, not necessarily unique to Jamaica. These are reasons that affect policy implementation globally. So in the policy discourse, when we're talking about the implementation of policies, whenever there is a disconnect between devising the policy and its implementation, we usually describe that as a policy failure or an implementation gap. So in Jamaica, what we find is that we often have great ideas. We know how to solve an issue. We have very lofty, glossy documents as it relates to how to address a particular issue. But what you find is that after we have designed these documents, we have some very profound approaches to addressing the problems. What you find is that when it is time to put those policies or approaches into action, you realize that what was actually articulated in the document and what is actually taking place in implementation it is not actually the same thing. And we're not achieving the broad objectives. This is what we call an implementation gap or policy failure. In a nutshell, when the policy is not achieving its stated objectives or outcomes. So we have various types of policy failures. These can arise from non-implementation. So non-implementation essentially is the case wherein the policy is not put in place. So we develop a policy document to address a particular issue, but for some reason, the policy is just not implemented. So this can be a reason for policy failure in government. Another reason can be unsuccessful implementation. So this happens when an attempt is made to actually implement the policy. However, because of external or internal factors, the policy was just not successfully implemented in the sense that the stated outcomes were not realized. So if the policy was intending to reduce poverty by a certain percentage, if there is unsuccessful implementation, the policy will be implemented. However, we would not have met the intended target. So this is what we call the unsuccessful implementation. And some of the typical issues surrounding why policies are usually unsuccessfully implemented can be because of just bad execution, can be because of bad policy or just bad luck. And these three reasons are usually the typical issues that characterize our policy development process in Jamaica. And these three particular areas, they are manifested in different ways across the public sector. So now I will focus on some general success and failure factors. And I say general because these are universal reasons why a policy might not necessarily be implemented successfully. And we can see that some of them, if not all, resonates with Jamaica. So I'll just speak to a few. So for example, we can look at the capability to implement presents a critical mass of supporters, supporters and critics. So if we should zoom in on the capacity to implement, which I will get into further in the presentation, it essentially looks at the extent to which the government ministry or agency or department, the extent to which it has the ability to implement a policy. So ability to implement a policy is oftentimes driven by technical know-how. So does the entity actually have the individuals with the expertise to implement these policies? Does the entity actually have the resources needed to implement what the policy hopes to achieve? So these are usually some of the issues that will determine success. Another success factor can also be communication, commitment, coordination. These are important elements in the policy process because it will determine the extent to which the key players in the policy process, the extent to which they're able to carry their responsibility. And when those responsibilities are equally carried, then you will have that coordination that is needed for implementation to be successful. And finally, sufficient resources and support, because policies really cannot be implemented without the necessary resources, whether it be financial or non-financial. As it relates to the failures in implementation, generally, these are some of the reasons why a policy might not necessarily be implemented successfully. So one of the major one for us in a Jamaican context and regionally is that we often our social context is one where we have what is called meta problems. So meta problems are problems that really are not clearly defined. What do I mean by this? They're not clearly defined in the sense that these are usually social problems that addressing them cannot be done using one approach. You have to use various approaches. And so to apply that methodological approach, you must first understand what are the underlying issues that are driving the problem. So take, for example, crime and violence in Jamaica. That is a classic meta problem because it is not a clearly defined problem. It is not clearly defined because there are various elements that are contributing to the overall results we're seeing in terms of crime. And so oftentimes what we are challenged in a Jamaican context to do is to define what the problem really is. And so we can develop the appropriate solutions. Because if the problem is not properly defined and understood, it means that the solutions that we will be devising will not be the appropriate solutions. And so we will have a solution problem mismatch, if you want to describe it that way. So I will now turn my attention to looking specifically at what are some of the prime issues that Jamaica faces in terms of successful policy implementation and some of the issues that continue to be developed as it relates to successfully implementing policies. So one of the major issues for us is that we have not developed the capacity to conceptually define policy problems or societal problems that we face. So we face what is called a conceptual problem. So a conceptual problem essentially is that addressing a problem, we must first understand what the problem is. So how do we understand what the problem is? We can conduct studies, we can conduct various assessments to see what exactly is driving a particular problem. However, if we do not do a good job of understanding what is driving a particular policy problem, what you will find is that, and we do it very often, we develop solutions, we develop policy documents that tries to address the problem, but the solutions are not responding to what the problem is. And so what you find is that at the end, we do not really solve the problem because how we defined what the problem was actually incorrect. And so the solutions that we develop to solve the problems will also not be able to yield the results that we desired. And so what you find is that lack of appropriate problem definition usually results in mission drift. So we will develop a policy to solve an issue, but when the policy is being implemented, we realize that what we started out to address, we're not actually addressing that problem. That is reflective of a mission drift. So what you would have set out to achieve, you are not achieving that, but you are saying that you're implementing a policy. And oftentimes that is what the public sector reflects. We attempt to solve a problem, but we have not conceptually defined the problem correctly. And so we are using solutions that are not appropriate are not responsive to what the problems actually are. And that if we should do an assessment of our crime problem over the years, this is one of the components because crime solutions to crime continues to be elusive, although the government has taken several steps. And as I would have mentioned earlier, the problem of crime is multifaceted. So no one solution will fix crime. So you have to start with fixing education. You have to look at how you improve the welfare of citizens. You have to look at how you develop the capacity of the security forces. You have to look at how you build citizen trust in the system, government, as well as the security forces. So you can see that to address the problem of crime, not one single solution will do so. It requires a combination of approaches that will operate at the same time simultaneously to address the problem. However, we will not address the problem if we have not appropriately diagnosed the problem. And I believe that we're at that stage now as it relates to the crime problem where we're still attempting to diagnose what really is the problem. Because if we don't diagnose the problem correctly, then it means that the solutions will not be yielded as we intend for them to be yielded. So usually to address this mystery as it relates to our continued failed efforts at proper problem definition, it really relies upon policy design, how you go about ensuring that the policy is designed appropriately. And one key factor that must be considered is how the policy is implemented must be based upon a valid theory of cause and effect. So going back to the crime example, we have to be able to say clearly what are the factors driving crime, what are the causes of crime. And then once we have established what are the causes, then we're in a position to devise solutions to respond to the effects of crime. So we first have to start at the point of properly defining what the causes are. And another element that can also help us with defining properly what our policy problems are really looks at proper communication among key stakeholders across government, and this speaks to coordination. So communication and coordination has not been a strong point of policy implementation in Jamaica for many years. So what you will have is a case where we're attempting to address an issue, but one government entity has one approach to addressing the problem, and then you have another entity having a different approach. So what you find is that there is an absence of collaboration. So it's a case where the left hand does not know what the right hand is what the right hand is doing. And so you don't have that joined up government. But I think we're now at a point where we recognize that to solve some of the problems that we're facing and given our resource constraints, we must adopt a more collaborative approach across government to ensure that we eliminate duplications, because in duplication, we can find resource wastage. And in a context where we do not have adequate resources to address the multiple needs that we have to ensure that efficiency is maximized. And so coordination is an area that we must continuously strengthen, because it is an area that we have not been very strong at in the past. I will now transition to looking at the political side of things. And it is important to assess the political side of things. And when I say the political side of things, I am not so much looking at partisan politics. I am not so much looking at political parties. I am looking at the structures as they exist in the country based on our system of government. So the political problem that we continue to face, and which I must say there is some acknowledgement of some of the issues and attempts being made to address some of these through various initiatives across the government. So one of the key issues arising out of the political problem is that the bureaucracy that we have. So the bureaucracy centrally is this processes, the systems that government have in place to implement policies. So the bureaucracies, as we know it, the public service, what we find is that our public service has largely been built on a centralized basis. Centralized in the sense that in addressing our problems, what we have done is to adopt a central approach. So most of our policies are derived, are developed at central ministries or central authorities, departments, or agencies. But the challenge and the flaw with this approach is that, one, we are not able to properly develop solutions that are responsive to local needs. So say, for example, you have a case where a central ministry is developing a policy in response to an issue in Westmoreland. However, what you find is that the engagement of stakeholders in Westmoreland is limited. So what you find is that the personnel, the technocrats within the central ministry, they have taken onto themselves the responsibility to be able to develop a policy that adequately responds to a local issue. But the flaw within that approach is that that central ministry will not be able to fully appreciate what the issues are. So what you have to do is to adopt a decentralized approach where you engage local stakeholders in the development process. So you will have to adopt what is called a bottom-up approach instead of a top-down approach where the solutions to problems emanate from people on the ground because people are living the problems. So they know what the issues are. So the best approach is to get the solutions from them. And for a very long period of time, several ministries have sought to devise policy solutions in a centralized manner. However, we are now in a period where there is greater recognition for the need for decentralization. And this figures on a topic that will come up in the policy series again about the important role that local government play, because local government is governors who are closest to the people. And when you have governors who are closest to the people, then they are better able to appreciate what are the driving forces that causes some of the policy problems that we have in Jamaica. So we have taken steps to decentralize the system, but oftentimes there is still too much centralization that exists. Another element of our politics dilemma in the implementation process that usually hinders successful implementation is interest groups. So interest groups essentially looks at how groups with particular interests is able to exert their influence over the policy system, the policy implementation. And when you have that interest group pressure, it usually manifests itself in several things in terms of corruption, in terms of the misalignment of resources. So we have to consistently look at how to improve implementation of policies to eliminate some of the interest group pressure that is applied to politicians. And the final aspect of the political problem for this slide, we'll look at political interference. So we operate on a system where it is what is called a policy administrative dichotomy. It is a dichotomy because the executive is in charge of policy, while the public service, the public sector, is in charge of implementation. So once the minister would have developed a policy through cabinet, the minister's role in terms of implementation really should cease there, because the minister should not be too much involved in implementation. Although the minister, there is some convergence in the idea that the minister must play some role in terms of implementation, but what we want is that ministers do not get too much involved in the implementation, because what you find is that once ministers become too engaged in implementation, you will have undue regard for principles of fairness, principles of justice, principles of the fair application of resources. And you don't want a situation where a minister is using politics in how government policies and programs are implemented. So these encapsulate some of the problems that we have faced in the past and that which we continue to face, and which the government has made numerous attempts to strengthen our capacity to respond in a favorable manner to address some of these problems. And the next big ticket item that we must address is the element of corruption. Corruption operates at various levels across government, and corruption is an important enabler of policy failure. It is an important enabler of policy failure because what corruption does, it distorts, it diverts resources from policy implementation. And once that happens, what you will find is that the intended outcomes of a policy will not be achieved. And so when you have corruption being involved in policy implementation, you will find a system where there is a breakdown in institutional governance. Institutional governance essentially looks at the extent to which the public service through ministries, agencies, and departments, extent to which they're able to implement policies and programs according to government procedures, according to guidelines, because there are various guidelines that must be adhered to in policy implementation. But when you have corruption coming into being, corruption usually undermines those guidelines. And so the end result is that the net benefit from a policy is not yielded, because if a certain amount of resources has been allocated to address a problem, what you find is that if corruption gets into it, it will usually cause a diversion of those resources. And once that happens, you will see a situation where the policy will just not be implemented as it should be. So this is just a diagram that reflects the various elements at which corruption can take place. Within our context, we oftentimes focus on political corruption, looking at it from the standpoint of politicians, but corruption also happens at different levels across our governance system. Irrespective of where it exists, it presents a clear threat to the successful implementation of policies because it distorts institutional strength to implement policies, and it also divert important but scarce resources that we have. So this excerpt came from Christine Lagarde, the former managing director for the IMF, where she made mention that corruption in the public sector weakens fiscal capacity, it discourages investment, perpetuates inefficiency, and entrenches poverty and it should be inequality. There's also a growing gap in trust in institutions. A key factor fueling this distrust is corrupt and unethical public and private sector behavior. So in a nutshell, corruption has the ability to completely cause a policy that has good objectives, that have good intentions, to become a failure because resources are diverted and public officials do not actually do what they are being paid to do. And so you find a situation where we are ending up with the problem still existing without the appropriate solutions that the policy would have anticipated. But as I would have mentioned earlier, the government has been doing various things to build our institutional capacity to respond to corruption. And one of the latest attempts that was promulgated through the parliament this week was the implementation of new regulations that will guide the appointments of boards in Jamaica. Boards in Jamaica, essentially, so we would have engaged in a discussion earlier as it relates to the fact that ministers are really in charge of policy. Ministers have the purview of policy implementation, of policy development rather. The public servant has the purview of policy implementation. So once the minister through the executive have expressed certain policy desires, certain policy wishes, it is now incumbent on the various agencies, the ministries, to implement these policy desires. Public bodies are usually agencies or bodies that comes from various ministries and departments. These are usually consisting of boards, and these boards are appointed by ministers. The board's primary responsibility is to preside over the operations of the particular agency or public body. When I say preside, it is not necessarily saying that they will be the one to be doing the day-to-day activities of these entities, but they are responsible to ensure that appropriate systems are in place to eliminate corruption in the entity, to ensure that the entity is implementing the policy mandates that would have come from the executive, and also to ensure that public resources are being managed and spent in a responsible and prudent manner. So I bring your attention to this new institutional response from the government to address concerns about continued issues of mismanagement from public boards. And so what this new regime will do is to introduce criteria for how ministers can appoint boards and how boards generally will be appointed. So these are some of the the new regulations that will govern board appointments. These regulations, they're important because what it does is that each of them is intended to solve a problem that we have had for many years. That problem is a case where ministers appoint individuals to public boards. In too many instances, these individuals do not possess the necessary qualifications. In one instance, these individuals do not adhere to good corporate governance principles. These individuals are oftentimes appointed based on their political associations. Nothing is inherently wrong with being appointed based on your political association. However, if we're going to solve the policy problem that we face, we must ensure that those appointed, they are competent and they have the ability to ensure that the entities within which they preside over, they have the ability to ensure those entities are successfully implementing policy so we can solve some of the problems. So just to go through quickly a few of the regulations. So now what the regulations will do is to introduce fit and proper tests that will be required for service on a board. So essentially in the previous dispensation, a minister had to just have someone in mind and appoint them to a board without any due diligence being done as to the fit and proper nature of that individual. What the new regulations that has been passed by the Minister of Finance in the House this week will do is to ensure that a fit and proper test is done on potential board members. It will also require by law that individuals to be appointed to government boards, they have specific competencies. So if you are going to be appointed to a board that deals with the management of a health region, then it logically follows that you must know actually something about health, you must know something about management, you must know something about prudent fiscal and financial management. So what this new regulation will do is to ensure that as best as possible, those to be appointed to boards, they have some form of expertise that is relevant to the board on which they will be appointed. And so this is a positive that we're seeing as it relates to a recognition that we have a problem and how we should respond to addressing that problem. So just to surmise on the point of the impact that corruption has on the successful implementation of policies, we have seen several initiatives being undertaken by this administration, some of them being the continued look at how to strengthen the Integrity Commission, our principal agency commission that is charged with probing allegations of corruption to ensure the significant elimination of corruption across government. The board regulations that I just mentioned, the promulgation of institutions like the Financial Investigation Division, the Major Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Agency, all of these institutional responses are designed at addressing the problem that we have of corruption, because it is recognized that corruption is a significant hindrance to the effective implementation of public policies. Let us turn our focus looking at administrative problems that causes us to not be able to implement policies effectively in Jamaica. One of the major problems that we have is that we design policies that when you read them, you are inspired. You get the sense that the policy understands the issue. The policy understands the assignment. However, what you find is that when rubber hits road, the policy really cannot yield the results because of what is called a lack of institutional capacity. Institutional capacity essentially looks at, okay, we have this policy to be implemented. This implementing agency is required to implement this policy successfully so that you can address the problem that the policy sets out to solve. However, what you find is that oftentimes these implementing agencies, they do not have the resources to implement. And if you do not have the resources to implement, this pretty much means that you will have a policy, but you cannot put that policy into action because you do not have the resources. And so institutional capacity is a major issue. And so we must look at how to continuously develop our capabilities as it relates to resources as well as technical know-how in some of these agencies. So we must continue to look at these. And this is an area that the government has been looking at how to address it. So if we look at the steps that have been taken as it relates to the Jamaica Constabulary Force, there is a recognition that for us to adequately respond to crime, we must have a security force that is oiled, that is agile, and that can respond to the issues that it faces as it relates to crime. And so what you have seen is that the government has made considerable, I would say unprecedented investments in the security architecture. So you can see that there is investments in building out the ballistic capability of the security force. There is investments in acquiring a number of ships, a number of helicopters to be able to patrol our borders, investments in building the investigative capacity of the JCF. So all of these speak to institutional capacity. And this is an area that we have not done very well at in previous years. And so institutional capacity is an important component that oftentimes result in policy failures or policies not being implemented properly. And this brings to what is described as pressure of time. So essentially what you find is that a lot of agencies, they are given the responsibilities to implement a policy. However, they are not resourced properly, and they have various other issues that they are contending with. And so all of that coming together does not facilitate effective implementation. And finally, the other element of the administrative problem that we have in Jamaica is the lack of coordination and cooperation. So if I might make reference to the crime monster that we continue to be bedeviled with, in previous years, what you have found is that the responses to crime have been fragmented. So this government agency is doing one thing, another government agency is doing another thing, but you do not have collaboration and coordination taking place. In the absence of collaboration and coordination, what you find is that efforts are being duplicated. So different agencies are doing the same thing. And so the resources are not yielding maximum return. And when we have a situation like this, it results in policy failure, it results in successful implementation of policies because it means that we are not maximizing our resources. It means that the lack of coordination results in a situation where we're all doing the same thing. However, there is also an element of the problem that is not being addressed because government agencies are not coordinating. They do not know what each other is doing. So with greater coordination, what you will find is that a more deliberate and strategic approach can be adopted that results in us being able to pool our resources together across government, being able to define what the problem is collaboratively, and being able to develop solutions collaboratively that will be used to address the problem. And in so doing, what you will find is that each agency will focus on what they are mandated to do. So if this agency is strong in this area based on their mandate, they will focus on that. Another agency strong in another area, they will focus on what they are strong in. However, what you have is constant communication taking place. Each agency knows what it is, what each other is doing. And so you do not have several agencies doing the same thing and not getting the results that are intended. Another issue that we have in the successful implementation of policies in Jamaica has to do with what could be described as scaling up issues. So oftentimes we hear that government is implementing a new policy. However, they start with a pilot program. A pilot program usually is introduced into the policy discussion whenever we are going to be implementing a new initiative, something that has not been implemented previously. And we want to see how the initiative as defined and as designed rather by the policy, how the initiative will operate, whether it will yield the results that we want. What you find is that oftentimes the pilots will produce good results. So the Ministry of Education currently is looking at the sixth form pathway program. The ministry is intended to do this using a pilot approach. When they use a pilot approach, it will inform policymakers, decision makers as to what worked and what did not work. What scaling up issues here suggesting is that oftentimes when we get the results from these pilots, we know what the issues are. We put measures in place to address them. What you find oftentimes is that we do not have the capacity to expand these programs across a larger segment of the population. And so we are not able to increase the reach of the policy. So we have scaling issues. Another issue that underlies that scaling problem is that we have not done very well with monitoring and evaluation of policies that we implement. So what we do is that we implement a policy, we get the sound bites that we're doing something to solve this problem. However, what you find is that there is not a consistent review of the policy to see if the policy is actually achieving the results as it's set out to achieve. When this happens, it causes policies to usually fail, because if there is no monitoring, you essentially do not know whether the policy is working. And if you do not know if the policy is working, then it means that implementation would have taken place, but whether the policy is actually producing the outcomes, that is not actually being monitored and evaluated. However, what can be noted is that the government through the Cabinet Office continues to take steps to bolster the capacity of ministries and agencies to build out their monitoring and evaluation capacity, because it is through monitoring and evaluation that we're able to assess the extent to which policies implemented to solve specific problem, whether those policies are achieving the objectives. And finally, what we have a major issue with is procurement red tape. So earlier we would have discussed the impact of corruption. So what the dilemma that Jamaica faces is that in an attempt to respond to corruption in our context, we have implemented various rules. These rules relate to government procurement. What you find is that, however, the procurement rules, whilst they are well intended, oftentimes they delay the process of policy implementation. So you have an emergency, you have a situation where you require a policy to be implemented to address an issue that continues to plague the society. However, the procurement rule, for you to implement the policy, you are required to acquire certain goods and services. But what you find is that procurement rules continue to present bureaucracy in terms of how we acquire goods and services within government. And so oftentimes, when the policy do get implemented, the problem usually gets worse. And from the time when the policy was designed to the time when the policy was implemented, because of that lag period as a result of procurement bureaucracy, what you find is that the problem that we set out to solve, the problem usually changes, it evolves. And once this happens, it means that the policy as was designed will not be able to respond to the evolved problem. And so a policy will be implemented, but the policy will not be addressing what the problem, the nature of the problem at the present time. So procurement is an area that we have to continuously look at, and it is something that the government has taken steps to see how to better improve processes and to eliminate red tape across government. This component will put the knot on this overall presentation. So I want us to look closely as young people at this notion of poor fiscal management and political will, and how that has implemented successful policy implementation over the years. So what we have had in many years gone by is a situation where governments usually spend irresponsibly. So what we had was a situation where we were running budget deficits, so we were spending more than we were earning in taxes. and this created a significant debt burden. When you have a situation of this nature, what it does is that it puts us into a debt trap because we're not able to sustainably finance our programs, our projects, because at some point, our financiers, they're going to cut the plug on on continuously financing us. So if we should zone in on some bad fiscal policies, bad monetary policies that have been implemented in previous periods. So if we should look at an example of FinSAC, of I'm not sure how many persons are familiar with FinSAC, but that would have occurred in the 1990s. And this is a typical example of how poor policy implementation can create devastating impact. So what you had was a situation where government interest rates would have ballooned significantly. So if you had borrowed a loan from a commercial bank, you realize that your loan, the interest that you're paying would have ballooned. So a lot of persons would have defaulted on their debt. Government had a big part to play in this as a result of poor policies. If we should also look at this notion of run with it, that would have been an era of Jamaica's history where government was essentially on a spending spree. That money that they were spending financed by was financed by borrowing. That had implication for successful implementation because we could not sustainably continue to utilize those resources as well as to fund some of our programs. So we have taken several steps to address them, and I'm really happy at the place that we're at today, where this government has taken several steps to build our finances, and specifically to build greater debt management, new fiscal rules, and even the passage of the independence of the central bank the other day. These will have positive impact for policy implementation. And I'm at the end of the presentation, so I will just look at a successful policy that we can all reflect and say it was a masterful policy that was implemented. So since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government would have launched probably one of the largest social programs to ever be implemented in Jamaica's history, the CARE program. The CARE program, it has various elements, but the point I want to make in referencing this program is that this program was implemented and the objectives of the program were realized. But importantly, when the Auditor General would have done her assessment of the program, no significant issues were flagged that you could say that this is a bad policy of the government. So I would reflect and say this CARE program is one of our modern attempt at successful policy implementation based on the internal control measures that were implemented, based on the oversights put in place, as well as the monitoring and evaluation framework that existed. So all hope is not lost in terms of successful policy implementation. And I must say that the problems that I would have highlighted, they are not unique to Jamaica. They are typical of issues faced by small island developing states that are constrained by resources and that have developing institutions. And so we don't have anything to be ashamed of as Jamaicans. We continue to see strides being made in terms of building our institutions, and the government continues the effort to develop frameworks that responds in a responsive way to the issues, the policy issues that we face. And so what our role as young people really entail is for us to get involved, is for us to recognize that this is much more than politics. It is about our lives, it is about governance. And so we should find how we can contribute to this process. And at the end of the day, we can create a Jamaica that works for us all, as the parties song would say, equal rights and justice. This starts with fundamentally ensuring that policies are implemented that responds to social, societal issues. And we must continue as young people to advocate for improvements in our governance framework. And we can only get better from here as a developing nation. So I just want to say thank you again for all those who listened to me keenly. I trust that you would have taken a few things away from the presentation. And thanks to the organizing committee as well for having the foresight to put on such an insightful forum where young people can engage in a discussion about how to improve our system of policy implementation to make Jamaica a place where we can all live, work, and raise our families. Thank you again, Mr. Chair.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Brooks. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much. I must note that if there was ever a time, if one was to consider that any stone was left unturned, Mr. Brooks, you covered every area, you covered every corners. You asked the questions, you answered them. And I must say that it was truly a well put together presentation. I will just note some things coming from the chat here, where one member noted that, a participant noted that good points on the need for government and collaboration. See it all the time where the NWA would fix a road as part of their rehabilitation project, and then NWC dig it up to really, then NWC does their digging to ensure that they want to put in place a pipeline or so forth. Somebody just echoed Magati High School product. Tell them, Odane. Thank you very much, sir, for really bringing life to policy. After tonight's presentation, one can never question the importance of having policies or putting together policies that helps in the enrichment and development of a nation and of our society. And I must also add that how you really add the information, add the details. It wasn't just something that you really, it wasn't a grab and go session, but it was something that was really delivered as a fine lecturing session. And I know others will really apply it onto their daily lives and be more respectful, because at times we understand, Mr. Presenter, that we hear of an implementation, we hear of an opening, we hear of something new coming on board, right? But it goes back to where you add communication. And beside communication, I want to add education on a whole, because yes, we'll speak about it, but then again, we don't get that full understanding as to how these policies are executed. And we just think that the government is just has this draconian mentality in shoving something to society, and then the majority votes on it, so therefore it becomes law. And you really executed well. I think probably at some point in time, a little documentary or some little clipping can be put together to really express the full context and knowledge as to the importance of policy in our society. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure if anyone has any particular question to ask. Wow, I hear some predictions being echoed here, but you know what? I will not touch that because there's a time and there's a place. And the time is now, and now we are looking at policies. So while he continues to join the team in ensuring that the proper policies are put in place, I'm sure some policy measures will be put in place before that appointment is done, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, you have just heard our presenter, Odane, Mr. Odane Brooks, right? He touched the theme. He really buttered, he baked, he boiled, he fried the theme as it was just what? Key factors hindering proper implementation of policy within Jamaica. And he gave us a clear definition and clear-cut definition as to what policy entails, and as a nation, how our policies that we set, how it helps us, how it helps us in making better decisions for others to benefit from it. I'm not sure if there's any question that one wants to ask at this point in time before I bring back the policy chair, Mr. Dane Allen, to come and do his official vote of thanks before I pull the curtains down on this first part one of a three-part series as we focus on policies in our Jamaican system. If there is no other question, I'll just re-invite Mr. Dane Allen to join us online as he do an official vote of thanks.
Good night again, everyone. I want to first thank Mr. Brooks for coming out. He shared a very insightful and very informative presentation for us all. I was in tuned. I even had let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 pages with notes. So, you know, I was listening very keenly to his presentation. I also want to thank each and every individual who came today. I want to thank Mr. President for being here right through, and individuals from the G2K executive body. I want to thank each and every guest also. And I hope to see you guys next on our part 2 of our series, which will be on January 6, 2022. Mr. Rasheen will be our host. And as I said, I look forward to seeing each and every individual here at that forum also. Thank you. Mr. Morgan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. Thank you very, very much. I must take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to say thank you all on behalf of let me just do the top there. I know some members of the G2K management team. We had VP Tia, we had VP Tia, we had VP Tatiana. I see where we have Mr. Otis Codlin. Codlin, yes, Otis is here. And I see where we have, since I started calling names, let me just finish the top level attendees. I see where we have Sir Wong, VP Wong here, and other members, both current and other serving members. Okay, and Sanjay's in the house. Mr. Odane, good night, my brother, good night, my friend. And we have other chapter chairs. I must also take this initiative to say thanks to all the special invited guests, those who got the link and those who came on and those who are here supporting G2K Manchester chapter in their part 1 of a part 3 series as they focus on policy in the Jamaican system, in the Jamaican society. Ladies and gentlemen, as we bring this curtain down to a close, and our keynote presenter would have encouraged and echoed the sentiment, let us help to create a Jamaica that you and I one day would really want to not just only work and live, but also a Jamaica that we would want to retire in and encourage others to retire and enjoy retirement here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us on what is dubbed as Policy G2K Manchester Chapter Policy Series. This was part one of a three-part program. And the third part comes to us on the 6th of January. I know flyers will be shared, so each and every one will be up to date with the necessary information. I must say to you all, stay tuned and join us as we seek to do just more than politics. Once more, enjoy your evening and God bless you all. Take care.
Big up, big host, big up.